In journalism, when we are looking for stories that show abuses of power, there is a saying that we use: follow the money. Running for a political office, even a local one, usually requires a lot of cash. You need money to pay for campaign events, for staff, for advertising, for data that can help you target your resources. Most states restrict how much money donors can give to candidates, but Pennsylvania has no real limits. Political committees, individuals, partnerships and LLCs, all of these can give as much as they want. Corporations can do the same simply by creating their own political action committee. In 2013, I was a reporter on the staff of Pittsburgh's alt weekly, the Pittsburgh City paper. It was during an open mayoral election year, and the city was having a love-hate relationship with its attempt to limit political donations within the municipal races. Because these local campaign finance reform laws conflicted with the state's, the limits that were in place at the start of the race were thrown out by the courts. Money flowed in. But following the money in Pittsburgh is difficult. A Post-Gazette reporter, a few years before then, had attempted to track it, using a sampling of the data available. My story in the Alt Weekly a few years later also relied on a sampling. But to really see behind the scenes, to really follow the money, we need to see the whole picture. What made this analysis difficult to do is that candidates are not required to file their campaign finance forms electronically. This is a problem not just in Pennsylvania, but in many local governments around the country. Many candidates even still handwrite their reports, and the way that they record each contribution can also be problematic. Donors frequently give different amounts at different times throughout a campaign, and each contribution will be documented in a separate place on the report, not at all organized for easy reference. And so all the reporting that we were doing on money in Pittsburgh politics was coming from eyeballing these documents on deadline and doing our best to come up with numbers, almost back of the envelope style. It was this task of digitizing the records, more than 25,000 contributions going back a decade, that we took on in order to build our project, a tool called the Public Ledger. Using the database that we've created, we can account for every donor in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County and every check that they've written to a political candidate over the past 10 years. With it, we are populating a series of dashboards that let us see how their giving influences our local political system. But in order to get to a point where we could analyze the data, we had to build the data set ourselves, and that's what I'll be talking about here today. Building your own data to work with is an undertaking, but it's a common tool in the news industry, and it can help you see what is hiding in plain sight. Very often, if you are creating your own data, you will do so from paper records, or scanned images of paper records. The first thing to do then is to interview your data sources. Before you can work with it, you have to know what it can potentially tell you. In our case, we started with a campaign finance form that the county government requires that candidates use. The form helped us start to map out our data structure. What was being collected? When was information required versus optional? What were the official definitions of the fields? A mailing address, for example, according to the county, meant the address of your primary home residence. But you also need to know how it works in practice. Candidates and donors varied considerably in how they chose to give their mailing address. Very often, it was their place of employment. People also frequently use P.O. boxes. The address field would be useful to us, but not in all the ways that we had hoped for. Showing any data by location, for example, was out of the question. The data was just too dirty. It's also worth noting that we conducted some user interviews to verify our assumptions about how people were using the forms. You should also spot check your record collection. Even though there is an official form, people will still file it in their own style, and some data may be missing from the filings altogether. We learned very quickly that using any kind of OCR tool was going to be more trouble than it was worth. No extraction tool is going to get it 100%. You will always need to go back and check the work manually, even today, though the tools have improved substantially since we started our work. A good gut check on whether or not you should turn to data entry is to consider whether the other option, fancy as it may be, will take you more time overall than actually just entering the data correctly yourself. After you are familiar with the data that you are using and what you might be able to learn from it, start to write down the questions that you think it can answer for you. This will help focus your data entry effort. It can be awfully tempting to capture every piece of data on the form, but that will significantly increase the cost of the project in time and resources. This is a hard-learned lesson. At the same time, you don't want to get halfway through your data entry work and then realize there was a piece of data that you really wish you had to work with. so it helps to work backward from the questions that you actually want to answer. In our case, because we are talking about local data, tens of thousands of records versus millions, the small scale gave us an opportunity not practically available to those who work with federal and even state campaign finance data. We know the people in the data. We have faces to put to their names. And from both experience and research, we know that local political donors tend to give because of either personal connections or economic interest, far more so than ideology. Local politics is often practical politics. So when I began the project, I first looked at how we could show the network, who was in it, who was on the way out, who are newcomers, and when might they be influential on what issues. The signals that we decided that we wanted to look for included who did they give to? Are they selective, or do they hedge their bets? When do they give a check, and how did the timing differ if they gave to multiple recipients? How much did the amount given vary? And again, timing is important. When does it vary? Are they giving in non-competitive races, in off-election years? None of these questions get us clear answers about motivation, but they do help us start from a better place with our next set of questions. I began to figure out how I could tell stories with what the data could say by pulling some sample data that I entered from a few reports into analysis tools like Tableau and R. I explored the data to see what it would look like in aggregate. I then sketched charts both by hand and in Adobe InDesign, wireframing the dashboard that I wanted to create, trying to find the best way to answer the questions I had. This sketching was a constant process throughout the data entry as things became clearer about the state of the data. A lot of visualizations of campaign finance data, for example, show a top 10 list. Who gave the most money? But I didn't think the answer was really all that useful. So instead, I wanted to know whose contributions meant the most to the candidate who received it, at the time that they received it. By comparing the total a donor gave to what the candidate received at that same time period, a more interesting picture appears. A $7,000 contribution to Bill Peduto, in this case, would likely not stand out against the more than $1.5 million he raised. But a $1,000 contribution to Darlene Harris, who raised just over $6,000 in the same time period, probably got her attention. So before you start to build your data structure, it is also important to document your thinking at the start so that all fields are entered consistently in the same way. You'll also want to document your process and notes along the way. Two good ways to get started with a documentation system is to create a data dictionary and a data diary. We did our data entry using Google Sheets, and because we were a small group working closely together, we shared documents with each other. A data dictionary was one of those docs. This is a list of all the column names you're using and a detailed description of what each field is. For us, this evolved as we encountered data that didn't cleanly fit into our schema. For example, some entries included 2 names for the contribution given, likely spouses or partners who were on the check. We added additional columns and came up with rules for how to treat these situations so that we captured all the names but didn't count a contribution twice. So the bottom line, if anyone doubted what to do, the data dictionary was the rulebook. And another tip, when you are structuring data that you want to query later, it is very important to make your fields as discrete as possible. A date, for example, should be 3 fields: day, month, year, not written in all one cell. This will help you in copy editing and in cleaning your work later, as well as in your analysis. You also want to keep a data diary, something that documents where you are in the process and what decisions were made or still need to be made, a place to put any notes for yourself. For our project, we kept track of each report we just transcribed, the amount it documented in total, and the number of records it created, making it easy to fact-check later. We noted any discrepancies between our math and the candidate's math, and the treasurer's response when we called them to verify it. We also tracked who touched the data at each point, documenting who entered the data and who fact-checked it and when. In addition to keeping us accountable for our work, it also helped us come back to the project and pick up after periods of inactivity. There is a saying about doing data journalism: 80% of your work will be processing the data. While it's not always the sexiest of work, it is the most important to the accuracy and credibility of what you present. So here are a few quick other tools that we found helpful. You will make errors in your data entry, and you'll want to have that system in place for checking your work. We did that by having another person look it over, but we also ran our work through Google's Open Refine, a free open source tool that helps you clean your data. Dedupe is a wonderful tool made by our friends at DataMade. It uses natural language processing and machine learning to help you cluster the names in your data, a task we were very thankful that we didn't have to do manually. When you need to match multiple records to the same person, organization, or entity, you'll need to create unique IDs for each person on your dataset. Sometimes this can be done programmatically, sometimes you need to fill in the gaps manually. In this case, we used a random UUID generator online to create unique IDs to match the records of each pack in our dataset. For the final data processing, we're using Python and the third-party Python library Pandas to help us count, aggregate, and filter, along with other analysis. Our back-end database tools are SQLite and Postgres for storage and relational queries. Our project hasn't launched publicly yet, but we're hoping to soon. We have been working on our prototype. Right now, the prototype is built using Flask, and it will eventually become a Django project. And we're very excited to see it launched.